At 0247 on August 7, 1944, the first Panther tank appeared out of the fog so close that Sergeant Robert Callahan could hear its exhaust crackling between his teeth. He still couldn't see it. What he saw instead was a faint ghostly shape where the road should have been, a darker rectangle in a wall of gray. Then, an instant later, an eye-searing orange bloom. Muzzle flash. The German 75 mm fired blind, just like his own crew had done 2 minutes earlier. The round screamed overhead, clipped treetops behind them, and detonated somewhere back toward the battalion aid station. The ground shook. "Hold it," Callahan hissed. "Hold your fire." 26 years old. 11 months with the 823rd Tank Destroyer Battalion. And this was his first time fighting tanks he couldn't see. His 3-inch M5 gun sat nose onto the road east of Mortain, France, crouched behind a shallow earthwork they'd hacked out in the last daylight they'd seen. 6 feet of barrel pointed straight into a world where visibility was less than 15. On either side of the road, steep banks and hedgerows funneled anything with tracks directly into the little field of fire his crew had carved. That was the idea on the map anyway. Reality had arrived in the form of a Norman ground fog that had rolled in after midnight and turned the entire eastern approach to Mortain into a wall of damp cotton. The German tanks out there, dozens of them, might as well have been ghosts. All he had were a zzz sound. The distinct clatter of Panther road wheels and Koenigsegger-like diesel rumbles. A number. At least 6 in the lead group, more behind. And a gun that could kill them if he got the shot. Somewhere behind him, out of sight in the fog, 11 other American anti-tank guns from the 823rd and attached units sat in similar spider holes, waiting for shapes that refused to appear. Somewhere off to the south, another American gun fired, a bright orange bloom in the fog. Seconds later, the ripping snarl of German 75s answering it. Then the heavy, final whump of a gun position taking a direct hit. 1 gun gone, 11 left. Callahan realized something with the kind of cold clarity that makes decisions simple. The first crew to fire and stay put would die. The crews who fired, moved, and fired again just might live long enough to hurt them. He'd been turning one problem over in his head all night. How do you fight tanks you can't see with a gun? You can't move fast. Now the Germans, without meaning to, had given him an answer. He shifted his grip on the breech lever and gave his gunner the faintest hand signal. "Take it," he said. The gunner traversed a few degrees left, sight settling where that last muzzle flash had been. "On," the gunner breathed. "Fire," Callahan said. The 3-inch roared. The trails dug back a half-foot into the damp French soil. For 3 seconds, their own muzzle flash turned the fog into day. The hedgerow outlines. The crude earthwork. 5 men in steel helmets silhouetted against a burning cone of light. Then darkness clamped down again. They had just painted a target on themselves that every German tank in that column could see. Callahan didn't wait to admire the shot. "Move!" he snapped. "Trails, now!" 5 men dropped onto cold steel. They heaved. The M5 weighed over 3 tons on its carriage. On a good road, a deuce and a half could pull it all day. In churned-up French mud, with no prime mover hooked up and no harness, it was like dragging a dead horse sideways. They managed maybe 30 feet, angling the gun slightly off the line of the road, just enough. "Dig," Callahan ordered, already scraping dirt with his own shovel. From somewhere out in front of the behind the gray curtain, came a very different kind of explosion. A hard crack, followed by a deep rumbling. Whoomp! And a string of smaller pops. Secondary detonations. "Got one," the loader said, almost to himself. Callahan didn't nod, didn't allow himself the luxury. He slid back behind the shield and listened. The German answer came fast. 3 Panthers, maybe 4, firing in quick succession. Their shells hammered the spot where his gun had been 40 seconds earlier. One struck the crest of the rise and gouged a crater. Another smashed into the old gun pit, blowing earth and splinters aside. A third screamed overhead and went long. The fog magnified the sound, making it impossible to tell distance. They were shooting at AT. Memory. At the after-image of that last muzzle flash, Callahan's crew had just turned the deadliest weakness of a towed gun, immobility, into something like an advantage. All they had to do now was repeat that trick against approximately 200 CK tanks and self-propelled guns rolling into Mortain under cover of one of the thickest ground fogs Normandy had seen that summer. Towed guns are coffins. 3 days earlier, when Company A of the 823rd Tank Destroyer Battalion rolled into the sector held by the 30th Infantry Division near Mortain, the mood had been practical. They'd seen enough of this game to know what their lot in it was. The 823rd had already fought through the hedgerows around St. Lo. The script you saw called it Sandlo. They'd lost guns there. They'd watched German armor appear through gaps in the bocage faster than anyone had thought possible. Heavy gray noses pushing through green walls, blasting away before some gun crews even had time to kick the trail spades in. They knew the two truths of a towed anti-tank gun. 1. Once you go into position, you don't back out under fire. 2. If the line breaks and tanks get into your rear, your gun is a coffin with wheels. At Camp Hood, Texas, they drilled with the M5 3-inch on nice flat ranges. Prime mover stops. Unhook. Swing trail around. Dig in. Sight picture on a nicely painted silhouette target 1,500 yards away. Fire. Collect compliments from the range officer. Nobody had trained them for a world where you couldn't see more than 2 tank lengths ahead. Mortain was supposed to be easier than St. Lo. The breakout at Avranches was going well. Patton's Third Army was racing into Brittany and down toward the Loire. The German 7th Army, pinned and pounded, looked ripe for a pocket. Then Hitler, sitting in East Prussia with maps and an increasingly shaky grip on reality, ordered a counterpunch. Launch immediately from the Mortain area. Cut through to Avranches. Split the American armies. Drive them into the sea. Operation Lüttich. On paper, it was 4 Panzer divisions. 1st SS Panzer, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. 2nd SS Panzer, Das Reich. 2nd Panzer Division, 116th Panzer Division. In reality, those divisions were shadows of their 1940 selves, under strength, short on fuel, and trained crews. But they still had tanks. And Mortain still sat on a road net that, if shoved hard enough, could reopen the German front. The 30th Infantry Division, Old Hickory, held roughly 20 miles of front with 3 regiments. The 823rd scattered its 112 M5 guns along that line. Company A near Mortain itself. Company B around Saint Barthélemy. Company C in reserve. 4 guns here, 4 there, 4 somewhere in between. 12 towed guns against the largest German armored attack since D-Day. Intelligence had warned them on the night of August 6th. Tank noises beyond the ridge. Intercepted radio chatter about SS Panzer units concentrating. There was nothing subtle about what was coming. Callahan's Kirol. You dug in their 3-inch on the eastern approach to Mortain, because that was the obvious place to do it. They sighted the gun across a road funneled by sunken lanes and hedgerows, built low earthworks with picks and shovels, camouflaged the trails with branches, stacked ammunition in shallow pits where it would be handy, and hopefully not cook off if a shell landed near. Then they waited. Night fell. The fog rolled in. What had been a clear killing lane at dusk became a blind man's alley by midnight. Radio discipline tightened. Battalion HQ, afraid of direction finding and not wanting to give away gun positions, ordered near radio silence. By 02 the men at Callahan's gun could hear the enemy better than they could hear their own side. The Germans came on in low gear. An entire night attack. Hitler's grand hope to erase 8 weeks of Allied work, driving through soup. Callahan squatted in the damp earth behind the M5's shield, listening to the rhythm of Panzer IVs and Panthers. He could tell, even through the fog, that they were not charging. They were probing. That gave him time to think. The problem, 3-inch versus fog. On paper, the 3-inch M5 was a nasty little secret the Germans weren't supposed to enjoy discovering. It was essentially the barrel of a scrapped anti-aircraft gun mated to a strengthened field carriage. It fired a 76.2 mm shell at around 2,600 feet per second. With decent ammunition, M62 APC. Or, if you were lucky, the scarce M93 HVAP. It could punch straight through a Panther's side armor at 1,500 yards. Hole its frontal plate at suicidal ranges under 500, if the slope and luck were on your side. The effective range was listed at 2,100 yards. But all those numbers assumed two things. You could see what you were shooting at. 2. You had time to range and adjust. The fog mad. Both impossible. No long range. No deflection corrections. No pretty sight picture. Just noise and flashes. The tactical manual did not have a chapter titled, How to Fight 200 Panzers You Can't See with 12 Guns That Can't Retreat. So Callahan wrote his own chapter on the fly. He realized that in this environment, light C was as dangerous as steel. Any muzzle flash, German or American, was a beacon. His secret weapon for the night wasn't the gun itself. It was how he was going to use it. Fire at their flashes. Move before they fired back at yours. Repeat until someone ran out of ammo, men, or courage. It was insane. It was improvisation. It was the only plan that didn't involve simply staying put and waiting to be erased. Light in the fog, back to 0247. They'd fired once, hit something, and displaced. Now he crouched behind his gun's slightly new angle, counting under his breath. 10, 20, 30, no incoming. That meant at least one of three things. The Germans were confused. They were shifting to flank. They were more afraid of shooting their own tanks than they were of wasting shells on ghosts. A fresh muzzle flash bloomed off to the right, not on the road, but a few hundred yards into the fields. A Panther getting off the track, trying to work around what it assumed was a static gun line. "Trevor's right," Callahan said calmly. "There, where that one just was." Gunner swung the wheel. On. Fire. The M5 barked again. Flash. Recoil. The now familiar 3-second X-ray of their own position. 35 seconds later, something out there went up in a violent, sustained roar. Secondary explosions. They'd hit the tank's ammo rack or fuel. For a heartbeat, the burning Panther was visible as a dark shape in a cocoon of orange. Then the fog swallowed the light. Behind them, another American gun fired, then another, farther north. Company A was fully engaged now. The Bae Tattle had become a series of strobe lights in the murk. Flash here. Flash there. Response flashes in between. Each American gun's shot gave their neighbors one more data point. There's a tank firing back at position Baker's last flash. Aim a little left of that next time. That last German muzzle was higher, maybe a Panzer IV up on the bank. Adjust your elevation. The fog hid them. It also carried sound and bloom in weird ways. At Psalm 03 Huntsaw. Callahan heard the sound no gunner wants to hear from a friendly position. One of Company A's guns, maybe 200 yards down the line, fired. Seconds later, a German shell hit that same spot dead on. What came next was not just the dull thud of impact, but the brittle cascading crackle of bomb ammunition cooking off, and the soul-empty silence after. No yelling, no orders. Gun and crew gone. 11 guns were now 10. The German column's forward elements had stopped moving forward. He could tell by ear. Engines revving in place instead of growing louder. The subtle change from travel gear to maneuver. They were trying to fan out. Find angles. The Panthers were hunting gun flashes the way Company A was hunting theirs. Towed guns got no business in this mess. One of his ammo handlers muttered, too low to be more than a prayer. "Shut up and get me another AP," Callahan said, not unkindly. At Autry, 0320 new sounds slipped under the engine noise. Feet in wet grass. Low clipped German voices. The metallic clink of gear. Panzer grenadiers. Infantry probing forward to spot the guns for their tanks. They were the one threat his 3-inch couldn't handle. Not at that range. Not without turning itself into a lighthouse again. Behind him, one of the ammo handlers clutched at the antitank. Thompson submachine gun. It was their only real defense against men on foot. Callahan knew perfectly, well, that one burst from that Tommy gun would be as good as a flare. He waited instead. The German infantry shapes thickened in the fog, maybe 100 yards out. He could see hunched shadows moving in a line, rifles at the ready. He picked up a rock and lobbed it hard into the hedge about 20 yards to their right. The clack of stone on branches sounded, he hoped, like someone tripping. A Panzer grenadier fired a short burst toward the sound. 2 others joined, cautious. They were just as nervous about giving away their own exact positions as he was. Callahan used that hesitation. "Loader, hey-e," he said. "1 round. Set fuse quick." The loader, sweat trickling under his helmet, swapped out the APC in the chamber for a high-explosive shell and set the fuse for super-quick detonation. "On where they just shot," Callahan told the gunner. "Don't overthink it." The gun roared again. This time the blast came much closer. The HE shell hit low in the field, maybe 10 yards short of the German infantry cluster, but still close enough. The explosion slapped the fog. Fragments shredded grass, clods of earth, and, judging from the sudden German cries, at least a few of the men. That bought them another 30 seconds. "Move!" Callahan barked again. "New pit!" They manhandled the gun again, this time dragging it slightly back and into a hedgerow gap some farmer had cut years before for a cart path. They didn't have time to dig a proper emplacement. They scraped just enough earth in front of the wheels to keep recoil from throwing the piece back into the lane. The fight went on like that for hours. Secret no more. By dawn, Company A and the infantry of the 30th Division had turned Mortain into a killing ground. The fog lifted slowly, in veils. Where it thinned, they started to see what their blind work in the night had done. Burned out Panthers squatting in fields. Panzer IVs with holes through their hulls. Charred, skeletons of half-tracks crooked at the roadside. A knocked-out Panther Tiger that nobody could ever quite agree on who hit. The official tallies for Mortain credit: the 30th Division, the 823rd TD Battalion. Oh, close air support from P-47. Thunderbolts, once the fog thinned. Nobody can say exactly which Panther fell to which M5. What is certain is this. Those 12 towed guns, including Callahan's, killed far more than their share of the roughly 40-50 German tanks and assault guns lost in the Mortain sector that week. They did it under conditions no training manual had seriously expected. Zero visibility. No easy line of retreat. No heavy armor around them. Just men, a 3-inch tube on wheels, and a willingness to shoot at flashes and move before the return fire landed. The Germans had called such success unmöglich, impossible, when they got the after-action reports. Panzer officers who had rolled into Mortain expecting to brush aside undergunned towed pieces, the way they had in 41, were now describing American anti-tank fire as sudden, accurate, coming from nowhere, at very close range. They started referring in some reports to a new heavy American anti-tank gun they had not been briefed on. There was nothing magical about the M5. The secret weapon at Mortain wasn't a classified cannon. It was an aggressive ja, os mindset. The same kind that had pushed USS Tang into convoy centers, that had sent PT boats charging barges with 37mm cannons welded to their bows. An understanding that doctrine is written for perfect days, and Normandy in August 1944 was anything but. And a sergeant who was willing to turn every muzzle flash in the night, his and theirs, into a fleeting deadly range marker. After the war, histories of Mortain rightly gave a lot of ink to the stubborn defense of Hill 314, the fighter bombers that ripped up German columns once the weather broke. In the footnotes, you get mentions of the 823rd towed tank destroyer companies, holding in place, bleeding the spearheads, proving that even a coffin on wheels can be terrifying if the men behind it know the ground, trust their gun, and improvise under conditions no instructor back at Camp Hood ever imagined. They sent 12 guns against roughly 200 Panzers in a fog thick enough to hide a barn. The Germans called what happened to their tanks that night impossible. Robert Callahan and his crew called it doing their job with what they had. And if you've ever had a grandfather or great-uncle who dismissed his war with, "Oh, I just served on a gun line somewhere in France," don't be too quick to believe that just. Sometimes the guns that couldn't move, manned by kids who'd never fought blind before, were exactly what stopped a counterattack from rolling all the way to the sea.